we've done this two creations almost to death here. And one way we can track what appears to be the Davidic Genesis and the Elohim Genesis through this apocalypse. And as we read the apocalypse last week from 1st Enoch 85 through 90, you could see that it was pretty easy, at least at the start, to see that the animals represent different patriarchs, different people. Some we know, some we don't know. And I think you got that we started right from Adam and Eve here. And the people that are, quote, white, that is the white animals, are the progeny of Adam and Eve. Some of them are. And those that are not white are not. They come from somewhere else. The implication even is that they come from another creation. And certainly more than an implication here is that they come from the loins of monsters. And so I thought if somebody could run the text, I could go through and tell you where to put it up on the screen and explain it a little bit and see what you have to say. I mean, in this apocalypse is one that anybody with a little Bible background, especially in Genesis through Deuteronomy, the historic passages there, you ought to be able to interpret this pretty easily, at least part of it. It gets harder as we go along, but if you can, use your screen share and put up 1st Enoch 85. Or if you can't, you can follow along. You have to follow along in one fashion or the other, because this won't make sense unless you do, or unless you've got a really good memory from last week's reading. Okay. Father Yahweh, we pray that we're on the right track. It was so exciting to talk to someone today about, actually, as Commander Lee was here a little bit ago, about where the Yahad is going in our lessons and how so many are so active in internet ministry. And we want it to go ahead, but not if it's not of you. We don't want this to be just another theory. It's got to have some significance, and evidently, as you brought it, especially into Sean's purview, or his prophetic sense, we certainly need to follow it through until we can go no more. It seems like, Father, if we could get this teaching in the minds and hearts of fervent believers, it would change a lot of things. It would change a lot of things. In the meantime, bring it to our attention in a greater fashion. Give us the ability to explain it to others, we pray, in Yahshua's name. Okay, we're going to start, of course, at 1st Enoch 85. And if you can be looking at it or even screen sharing it, might take you a little, oh, you got it right there. Okay, super. You can read that through to yourself, and I'll try to explain a little bit and tell you when the scripture changes. So the animal apocalypse is a remarkable section in 1st Enoch. I've been enamored with it for years. One prophet said that the animal apocalypse is an original theological interpretation of human history. Certainly it is. this same one argues in his recent dissertation that this allegory was written early in the Maccabean period as propaganda to support Judas Maccabee's actions. I don't know about that. You be the judge. This exegete dates the section precisely. He says it was written in 165 BC and updated in mid-161 following the Battle of Edessa in March. We can read about that in 1 Maccabees 7:39 and 2 Maccabees 15:15. Then Nicholasberg, you might know that name. He's really a famous exegete today. He places 1 Enoch 9 and 10 and 12 through 16 in italics as an interpolation or an addition, which is made around 163 to 161 BC. Understand that this was just at the cusp of the Maccabean revolt. The allegory presents a history up to that point in the Maccabean revolt. An apocalypse has the characteristic that once the apocalypticists gets to their own time, as they are predicting what comes after that, they are trying to prophesy, and it often doesn't come to pass. What Brother Schruumkoff calls the apocalyptic lie at the end. I wouldn't dare say that, though. The intervention there of the Lord of the sheep, the shepherd, that didn't occur in history, nor does the judgment described at the end of chapter 90. There's no historical event in the Maccabean period that we can place as the historic, I should say, I'm getting as bad as Kamala Harris. Similar it is to Daniel 11. The history is only accurate up to the point where the author begins to speculate about the future intervention by Elohim to restore Israel. Yes, you find the same thing in Daniel 11. We find a second redactor in there that comes back. And in Deuteronomy, we see the same thing to correct what he said about where the history was going earlier. And that's the apocalypse. The apocalypticist gets to a certain place in history, and he has no other historical guidance from there. So he speculates. And you notice at the end of apocalypses that there's some usual gigantic hullabaloo in heaven, and all evil is destroyed, and the world becomes good again, and the kingdom of Elohim is everywhere, seen everywhere, and millions or billions upon the earth become converted. The real gospel era. At the beginning here, in 85, Enoch sees a white bull and a heifer. That's where we want to be, right at the beginning of that text. White bull, I think this is a pretty easy interpretation to make. Who wants to make it? White bull would be Adam.
Adam.
And how about the heifer?
That'd have to be Eve.
Yes, exactly. Notice they're white. This white, black, red has nothing to do with races. I bought a book off the used block called The Two Creations. And the writer of this, a guy named Mears, back at the end of the 19th century, uses the two creations to show that people who are not white are not children of God, but that they have come into a relationship with God later on. They are permitted into the kingdom, but white people, they are white because they were born into the kingdom. That's a pretty crass, offensive. In today's hearing, that would be extremely offensive. But maybe you want to read this little book, The Two Creations. I think the guy's, well, he's long dead now, but if we put out a book like that today, using the two creations for that purpose, can you imagine the backlog we would get? So, white is good. Black is bad. Red is dead. That's the interpretations of the colors, by and large. We have the story here of a black bull coming out of this bull and this heifer, and that it gored the red one, killing the red bull. Who would those be? The black bull and the red bull.
Has to be Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm. That gets us off to an easy start. Then the heifer came after the black bull, but the first white bull quiets her down. And she gives him another white bull. And this is a very significant white bull. Along with the white bull, many other bulls and black cows. This third bull is white, a reference to the purity of the line of who? Who's the third bull?
Seth.
Seth, of course. Of course. Seth was a very prodigious among the apocalyptic, especially the apocalypses that are outside the canon. So the line of Seth is to be a pure line. Then we go to chapter 86. The apocalypse here offers a history of the pre-flood world. The stars mingle with the cows in the following chapter, 87. Stars, obviously, this is how the book of First Enoch begins in its present form, with the stars falling. And these stars mingling with the cows give birth to elephants, camels, donkeys, all kinds of animals that are not in the created order. And that's important. Not in the created order. That's some explanations about why we have Leviticus chapter 11 in our scriptures, that is the law of beasts, that certain animals were not in the line of the creation by Elohim, especially swine. They were thought, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think that made me think in Genesis 1 when it keeps talking about that Yahweh created things after their kind. And after their kind,
Yeah.
And then, so he had a definite base creation, I think, that wasn't to be manipulated, was supposed to be manipulated with.
Now, there are so many Gnostic apocalypses where especially the Acts of John, where you've got all the demons and devils in hell and gods and the whole bunch of them making the man, creating the man. And that Gnostic theology, no human person was created by the good God, but rather by, again, Yaldabaoth, the evil creator God. Therefore, the Gnostics of certain types, they believe everything in the world is bad. And that because everything's bad, you're not expected to be good. So you can delve into any sin you want to. It's how you die that counts. If you die persecuted for your faith, which is Gnostic faith, which is totally without bridle, and if you're martyred by stoning by people who think they're good, then you can start your journey upward to the highest God in the highest level of heaven, and there live out your eternity. If you can get past all the angels that want to see you go back. That's pretty much the whole story behind the Gospel of Judas, actually. So there are a lot of people that believe like this. There was an order that wasn't created, and the stuff in Leviticus 11 that came forth wasn't. Doesn't give us a creator until we get here to the animal apocalypse. And you see that the stars mingling with the cows and giving birth to all kinds of stuff out of the created order. It's funny that he says actually elephants, camels, and donkeys. The cattle become scared. They begin to bite each other and even gore one another. This is referring to the fallen angels of Genesis 6 and, of course, 1 Enoch 6 through 11. So in 1 Enoch 87, a snow white person comes down from heaven and rescues Enoch out of the chaos and tells him to watch the elephants and other animals. So 87, 4 heavenly beings seize the fallen stars in chapter 88 and place them in the abyss, bound hand and foot. It's a wonderful story of Yahshua and his disciples going to the abyss in the Gospel of Bartholomew. It's entertaining, but it also tells us that though the abyss contained the devil hell that was 40 feet long, that even little Bartholomew could put his foot on its head. So what we can see that in the earliest parts of this vision, the identifications are obvious and straightforward, but as the allegory becomes more detailed, there's more difficulty determining what the original writer had in mind. The basis for much of the imagery of the animal apocalypse seems to be from Ezekiel 34. That's the sheep and the shepherds passage, as well as the frequent imagery we find in the Psalms. Israel as the sheep of God's pasture, that being in Psalm 95, 6 through 7 especially. And Enoch 89, 2 through 9, refers to the flood. Maybe you could put that up there. One of these 4 angels teaches the white bull or white bovine how to build an ark or a box. I think in my translation, I translate that literally. Ark means simply a wooden box. And this bovine, this cow or bull, becomes a man, and he builds it. Now that's pretty easy to figure out. The rising waters destroy all the animals, the ark lands, and a man and 3 cows exit the ark. There, according to this apocalypse. One moment, please.
Are you guys still seeing my screen share?
I'm seeing it.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'm trying to.
Hey, Jackson, that text there says 3 bulls stayed with him in the box.
What did they say?
It says 3 bulls stayed with him in that box.
Yeah, right. And that's what our commentary here says about it. That the rising waters destroy all the animals, the ark lands, and a man and 3 cows, 3 bulls exit the ark. Who would those be? Do we know who the man was? I think he was a bull that became a man. Yeah.
Yeah, that had to be his 3 sons.
Just like Fred McMurray. So the rest of Genesis and the slavery in Egypt seem to be summarized in 89, 10 through 27. Israel's represented again by sheep, who are surrounded now by wolves and rescued by the shepherd, or the Lord of the sheep. It seems to be, to me, Israel in Egypt and the Exodus right there. This dazzling Lord leads the sheep out of the swamp into the desert. In the desert, this Lord begins to open the eyes of the sheep. That's in 89:28. One of the sheep leads the nation, becoming a man, and is taken up into the sky. A clear reference to whom in verse 36. Well, what's the last chapter of Deuteronomy about? Isn't that the death of Moses? That's Moses. The sheep that becomes a man and is taken up to the sky is a reference to Moses, evidently. The sheep are then led across a stream into a good place, a pleasant and glorious land. We find that in 89:39, Jordan River, I would suppose. And then following in 89:39 and on, the sheep settle in that land. But when the sheep become dim-sighted, another sheep is appointed to lead them, and their eyes opened again. I'm not sure about that, but it seems like the Judges cycle. The time of the Judges. The sheep were oppressed by a variety of animals, Gentiles. The kings of Israel in about 89:50 are rams. And there's a little ram there in 50 who, any ideas? Okay, this is after the Judges. What comes next? No, the rams are the kings of Israel. Solomon is the little ram, the one who built a house for Yahweh of the sheep, 89:50. Very interesting here is the fact that the writer almost passes over the Davidic kingdom entirely. But in 8951 and following, we find significant detail for the divided kingdom after Shlomo. In verse 59, we have 70 shepherds summoned and commanded to watch over the sheep. These shepherds are held responsible for what the sheep do, implying these are the 70 elders or the priesthood of Israel that we've already read about in Exodus 24, Ezekiel 8, and back in 1 Enoch 34. Now, you know who R.H. Charles is, I suppose. He's the editor of the Jewish pseudepigrapha. He's not the translator, but the editor. And I used what's the guy's name that actually translated? Isaacs is his name. Isaacs, of all things. Isaac translated this. Charles was head of the editing. And if you look at Isaac's translation from your Charles edition, you will see copious notes that retranslate the Ge'ez language. And those copious notes throughout his translation, Isaac's translation of Enoch, show us the actual Ge'ez words and what they actually mean. Now, to translate this, did I learn the Ge'ez language? No, I did not. But there were such notes, copious notes of what these particular words were and what they were supposed to mean, that we have a very good glossary right in Charles' edition of Isaac's Enoch. Sometime take a look at yours and your Jewish pseudepigrapha if you got one. I'm afraid I haven't seen online any place that included the notes, but if you got the books, they'll be in there. Charles called the identity of these 70 the most vexed question in Enoch. He suggested that the 70 were angels since they received their orders from Elohim. Humans, on the other hand, would have been represented as animals in this context. Charles overlooks the fact that some of these characters in the story were humans. Noah, for example, he was a bovine, a cow, who became human when given the commission to build the ark, Noah. And he seems to ignore the fact that these 70 are judged for their mismanagement of the sheep, as were the elders of Israel. The exile is briefly narrated in 89, 68 through 72. The sheep are delivered to oppressors and many are killed. This whole part of the record, it saddens me that things couldn't go any better after 4 chapters. But all of a sudden, there's a writer or a secretary. I think maybe I called him in my version the recorder or the secretary. This writer records in a book how many have perished. I wonder if you know who that writer was, that recorder, that secretary. Think about it. This book was read aloud to the master of the sheep, and then it was sealed. Verse 72 is probably the return from exile and the rebuilding of the city and temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. In 89, 73 to 77, the city and temple are rebuilt, but the sheep are weak and poor-sighted. This is supposed to be the post-exilic community in Yehuda. And I think, if I am remembering correctly, that this recorder, tell me what I've got in there. Maybe I can see it. It's an 89. Okay. Let's see. Pasture.
I should have it right up on screen.
Yeah. I'm not seeing it.
80, what verse do you want? 89.
Oh, let me look
70.
again. Oh, I want to see that. 68 to 72. Is it in there? 68 to 72.
The shepherds and their herdsmen delivered all their sheep over to the wild beasts so they might be consumed.
Mm-hmm. The number each destroyed was recorded in a book by another. For each destroyed many more than was permitted. In the vision, I saw the scribe. I saw exactly how he recorded every single one destroyed by the shepherds. Of course, when I have italicized words and phrases in there, I had to supply those. All right. Well, another place it talks about the recorder, then, not here. And I believe that's Enoch. I think he's seeing himself in the vision. Because remember, in the part of Enoch called the similitudes, or the parables, or the mashilim, we have Enoch up in the sky someplace, and he's chastising angels and warning angels, and he's like the Son of Man in that section, calls this figure the Son of Man, the intermediary between angels and Elohim and humans. And then in a spurious verse, I believe in chapter 71, somebody interpolated a passage in there that said, and his name was Enoch. That is the Son of Man spoken of before. They think that a Jewish author interpolated in that there because the book must have been so popular with Christians who knew that Yeshua himself used Son of Man to describe himself, I think 150 times in the New Testament. It was his favorite title for himself. And the Christians were seeing Yeshua in these passages, in the parables, similitudes. Let's see, I think it's about chapter 70. I can't remember now. And so they interpolated this passage that says, and his name was Enoch. So the Christians would afterwards, they would copy that book with what was perhaps a lie in it, and would become less enamored with the Son of Man than they believed.
It seems like if this wasn't with the person that's described as the scribe here, if it wasn't Enoch, then it must be some person or being thus nowhere else spoken about, I would think. At least nowhere I've ever heard of.
Well, the only other one I could think of, I'm not sure whether it's at this time or not, but Ezra, Nehemiah, they might be a little later. Okay, well, the book is sealed. And then it says in my commentary, 72, verse 72 is probably the return from exile, the rebuilding of the city and temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. And then in 89, 73 to 77, even the city and temple are rebuilt, but the sheep are weak and poor-sighted. Now, we've already talked about that. So the first section of this animal apocalypse closes following the story of the Hebrew Bible from Eden through the exile, although it's remarkable how little is said about David and Shlomo, David and Solomon, taken as a propaganda piece for Yehuda, Judas, and the future Hasmoneans. The first part of the animal apocalypse is more interested in presenting Judah, Yehuda, Maccabee, as a legitimate successor to other leaders who were empowered by the master of the sheep to lead the people out of slavery and into the glorious land, such as Moshe and Joshua, son of Nun. How are we doing on time? Okay, I got 20 more minutes. Then we go to First Enoch 90. This period of history is from perhaps 426 BC to 265 BC. 37 shepherds pasture the sheep. Then 23 shepherds pasture the sheep. 58 seasons total, rather than 70 as expected. It's always 70. The number could be 35, according to Charles' notes in there. If so, then the numbers break down 12, 23, 23 equals 58. What's the significance of that? I don't know. This section seems to track the history between the return from exile and the Maccabean period, although it's very difficult to know what to make of the 58 seasons. So there we have it. 12, 23, and 23 is 58, the number of seasons that this goes on. Other than a general description of the various Ptolemy and Seleucid kings that fought over Palestine. And when we were doing the study in the Maccabees and the first Jewish revolt, we talked a lot about those guys. We looked at their family lines. And remember, by the end of the Maccabees, they were just right back where they started from. Like in Daniel 11, the apocalypse grows more detailed in this Maccabean period. That is 96 through 12. A great horn grows on one of the lambs and rallies the sheep against the oppressors, likely Yehuda Maccabean. In 90, 13 through 19, the sheep, that is Israel, battles the beasts, which are significant as Gentiles in general, but Seleucids in particular. Remember, those were one of the remnants, the remnant army of one of the Alexander's generals. Seleucid was his name, and the empire, which was primarily Syria and East, was taken over by Seleucus after Alexander died. And these are the ones that were pestering Israel. They took over the temple. They took over some of the religious movements there. And really, those that were in favor of these Seleucids and those Jews against the Seleucids, they had something of a civil war the whole time. And as we learned in those sessions, it wasn't so much a war against Greece or against the Seleucid Empire. It was really a civil war, Jews that were Hellenistic against Jews that were trying to get back the originality of Israel. So here we have the master of the sheep intervening in wrath. He strikes the ground with his rod, and a great sword is given to the sheep to kill the beasts of the earth. I think we're still in 90 here. This could refer to the victory of the Maccabean revolt. If it is, it's highly exaggerated. If the master of the sheep is Elohim or a messianic figure, then he did not directly intervene in the revolution against Antiochus for Epiphanes, the little horn. But verse 19 is the key. A great sword was given to the sheep. This divine passage indicates a human agent was given permission by Elohim to successfully make way against the Gentiles. There's a reference here, CF, Revelation 6:4, not Revelations. So we go to 90, 20 through 27. The apocalypse is now shifting to the future. As a great throne is set up in the pleasant land, we are told only that he sat upon it, with the implication that the master of the sheep who struck the earth with his rod is the subject. The master begins the judgment of the sheep and of their shepherds. I'm sure you will not forget Ezekiel chapter 34, first 10 verses, where the great master will judge the shepherds of Israel. In verse 20, then, the books are opened, and 7 shepherds are punished for killing more sheep than they were ordered to. Perhaps this refers to the various nations who had oppressed Israel, most of which were part of the Seleucid Empire at that time, namely Syria, Babylon, Persia, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, etc. And in Nahum, Assyria isn't judged for their role in the destruction of Samaria, since this was ordained by Yahweh. But they were judged for going far beyond the decreed destruction by killing and torturing more victims than necessary. Those days, kings or rulers were much more brutal than they are now, that we have, at least up until 2020, some kind of law happening here, some kind of enforcement. The same thing can be found in Obadiah, concerning the Edomite atrocities back when Judah was captured, 586, I believe. These are cast into the fiery abyss in 24, verse 24. The 70 shepherds are found guilty as well and cast into the abyss to the right of the house. Verse 26. Presumably, Gehenna the ancient dump on the south side of Jerusalem, but east of the temple, the place that was thought to be at that time the opening that took you down in fire to the second and fifth heavens and the lake of fire. Gehenna. And you already know just about every place where Yeshua talks about hell in the King James Bible, that's covering up Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. Now, a very beautiful park that anybody can go to. Lush trees, beautiful blue grass, tourists having picnics right on top of the remnants of all the lepers, corpses, and the worms that extended from them. So the master of the sheep, he renovates that old house, temple maybe the city of Jerusalem, into a new and greater house. That's 90:28 through 36. The old temple is torn apart. It's replaced with a more beautiful building and ornaments, recalling Ezekiel 40 through 48, which is chocked and packed with the Zadokites. Traditions about a new Jerusalem are widespread in the Second Temple Judaism, including as late as Revelation 21, 1 through 4. And First Enoch, which, as I mentioned before, comes in 5 different parts, and some say 6, is certainly a part of these traditions. The vision can't refer to the early Second Temple, which wasn't at all beautiful. This is a prophecy of a restored Solomonic temple, and perhaps even a reference to the Herodian renovations. It would seem odd, though, for the Herodian temple to be praised so highly. The sheep are white and their wool is thick and pure in 90:32, and their eyes are opened to see only good things. For the first time, there is, and I quote, none among them who do not see, 90:35. All the sheep that had survived and all the other animals worship the sheep. Look, that is not unlike how we see the middle period of the millennium. And do you remember now in Daniel and Revelation and every other apocalypse I can think of? They have big endings where the whole orchestra comes out and the whole cast comes out and takes 2 or 3 curtain calls and everything's wonderful after that. I'm hoping so. Some of these other animals that survived probably refer to the mass Gentile conversion after Israel is established in the land that is prophesied in Isaiah 14, and Isaiah 66:12, and 19 through 21. And finally, coming down to the end here, in First Enoch 90:37 to 38, there's a new snow white bull born with huge horns. After the sheep and animals of the world fear this new bull, all of them, he began to transform all the animals into snow white cows. We go back to the beginning and remember what these white cows were. And this personages doesn't stop until they're all transformed. This isn't a vision that focuses on Dawid. One exegete says that the presence of such a messianic figure here, though, should not be surprising. In fact, this ideal shepherd may be drawn from Ezekiel 34. There, a new good shepherd appears in the future, replacing the bad shepherds who had failed to care for the sheep of Elohim. Now, one problem is that this messianic figure in this section isn't a sheep at all, like David and Solomon, but it's a bull. This figure is a new Adam or Seth. The last characters in the apocalypse to be described as bulls. There's a new Adam soteriology or salvation, and this ought to sound familiar to us readers who are messianic. The closest analogy, one said, is in the two Adams theology of the Apostle Paul. It wasn't long ago that we went through that. The first man, Adam, became a living soul, nefesh. The second Adam, a life-giving spirit. Even if the reference is to Seth, then this bull is a son of Adam, a son of man. What is remarkable is that all the animals are transformed into snow white cattle. Transformed. What unexpected universalism. The apocalyptic lie? Why does every apocalypse end this way? I love to see it happen. I believe it will. But it's unexpected and it's universalistic. In the eschatological age, that means in the last times, the nation will convert and worship the Elohim of Israel alone. Finally, we come down to the end, verse 39 through 42 of chapter 90, and Enoch awakes from his vision. Just like Pilgrim awoke. And in Pilgrim's Progress, he says, alas, it was only a dream. Enoch awakes and he rejoices in Yahweh. And he weeps greatly because of the vision which he has seen. And that, my friends, is as much of an interpretation of the animal apocalypse that I think anyone can do. There's a lot of speculation in the middle of that, what these things stand for. And I would think that most would not consider that an apocalypse in the sense that, say, we do, or that at least that I teach as a definition of apocalypse, but rather as a prophecy. Most Christians today, and hey, Hebrew roots Baptists, they're going to say that apocalyptic literature is prophecy, even if they see the 11th chapter of Daniel that didn't take place, or the last couple chapters of Revelation, which haven't taken place yet. But I think one of the reasons I'm a preterist in the first place is that the rest of the stuff in these apocalypses meld so closely with the actual history of those times, insofar as we know it, that we just, Schruumkoff and I, just get to a place where we can see a turn from history to mystery. And that is the end of every apocalypse, when everything turns right again. So now, I suppose you can see some vestige. Well, it's vestige. This is actually portraying the progeny, the ancestors, the descendants of Adam and Shem and Shemp, maybe even Curly. And so the two teachings, they fold together very nicely. When I first did this, I did it without commentary. I'd have to go back to that recording because I got clear up until right in the smack dab middle of the 1st century AD in my attempts to interpret that animal apocalypse. Now I'm understanding that the other vision in the dream vision section, what do they call that? The 10-week prophecy? It comes right before this, also folds in with this. I have to do a little more on that. It's been too long for that. So, we got any questions or comments?
I would agree. First of all, I don't know if you're reading chat, brother, but thank you. That was excellent. I enjoyed that. And second, I would agree with you. I think that the animal apocalypse and the fact that of the two creations testify of each other, I think, which is really interesting because you figure they were written so far apart that if the animal apocalypse was written, isn't what it claims to be, then somebody would have had a pretty deep understanding of that two creations to even make it like that, read like it does, in my opinion. Maybe I'm thinking too much into it.
Well, Sean, either that or they had no idea. And just common knowledge in the apocalyptic mindset. I don't know. I like to think that they did know. And well, one of my teachers said any Jew will tell you that there were two creations and not one. But that seems to pan out in those two, in the Genesis 1 and 2, and this animal apocalypse, and in the begats, the Toledot of the Israelites as well. Just look at Yahshua's Toledot. One is from Mary, we heard say, that's Matthew, and the one from the perceived father, Joseph, is in Luke. How do you know that Matthew has Mary's? Well, it's got 5 women in it, including Mary. And Lucan does not. So it just goes to show that Mary's in that genealogy, and that is her genealogy as well. And all those other brothers and cousins that he had, they all had that. And I can imagine if it was really in the 1st century BC, AD, and even back to the 2nd century BC at the time of the Maccabees, if these Hebrews were as fervently looking for a messianic figure, who else would they be looking at but the family of David and Solomon? Of course, Rehoboam took care of himself. That was he didn't get to do much because he brought Israel back to paganism. But Solomon's other son, Menelik, in Ethiopia. Yes, I believe that. That's part of the Ethiopian canon, the Kibber Nagash, the glory of kings. telling the story of Menelik coming to Israel and taking that Ark of the Covenant away. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.